Well, hello there, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages. My name is Dogboat333 and welcome back to a tier list video. Now, I think this would have been right at the start of 2021. I made a video talking about the US presidents in TNO. I went ahead and did a little tier list for them, just to kind of rank them and talk about them. And it did it decently well. It was the most viewed video on my channel for a while, at least after I privated the Russian warlord tier list of the similar equivalent. But like the Russian warlord video, I figured it's not the best, although I feel more confident about the US president one than I do the Russian tier list. There's still some stuff I did want to rework, plus we had a few updates come out which kind of changed some stuff, and I just wanted to give it a shot and go ahead and reevaluate what I did to rank it. So, I think last time, if you watched the last video, you might recognize a couple of these tiers. S, A, B, C, D, and F. Typical for every tier list. We don't do E tier because I don't believe in that shit. If you can't get it on test, you're not going to get it from me. We also have F to pay respects, which we will get into. There's a very specific tier for a very specific man. May the Lord rest his soul. And then we have another F tier for, fuck man, I don't know. This is for most of the 1972 presidents, just because you have like 100 days content. So most of them, you don't really get a good feel for them because they're not really in the game, or they're not major figures, so you don't really get a good grasp on whether it'd be very good or kind of okay or kind of bad. There also are some exceptions, but we'll get to those when we get to those. But let's go and place him off the bat. So for the fuck man, I don't know. George McGovern might be interesting. I don't know. Interesting that he's still considered Republican because he's pretty wild even for the center. But that's neither here nor there, and we'll see how he ends up turning out in TNO 2. Same with Scoop Jackson. Bombs and welfare. That sounds pretty fun. But alas, only 100 days of content. Don't get a full feel for him, so it's not going to work out. Then, Jean Kirkpatrick, the NPP far-right neoconservative lady, overthrowing Latin American governments. Always a classic when you're talking about American government and its foreign policy in the Cold War, but don't have too much to judge it on. And then Robert McNamara, a.k.a. the guy who instituted McNamara's Morons, which enlisted people who were of low IQ to serve in Vietnam, and they died in higher numbers. Go figure. Then became pretty regretful after the fact, led the World Bank, and then tried to atone for his mistakes. Whether he did so rightfully or not, that's not my place to say. But it is my place to say that I don't know much about his content in TNO, so we'll go and do that. And for the F to pay respects here, we of course have to give it to the man, the myth, the legend, John Kennedy. Too good for that world as it was too good for this world. May the Lord bless his soul, and may you have better luck in another life. Rip 07 indeed, Mike. So, that gives us a couple of these guys. For some reason, we have George Wallace twice. It's a little bit of a horrifying thought. So, what I think I'm going to do, because I think I just went in normal order, I think I'll go ahead and go through election order and when they appear, other than obviously, you have to pay respect. So, you start off with old Richard Nixon, good old tricky dick. You can't lick this dick, except it is hard programmed for him to resign. So, the dick gets licked. Penis. Okay, now that I made enough jokes that this video might be demonetized, let's go and talk about Nixon. How good or bad Nixon can be is... I should probably talk about how I'm going to rate these. Part of it's just going to be my own opinions on their policies, this and that. Part of it is also going to be based on how much fun they can be. Now, full disclosure, I've played RFK a little bit. I've played Glenn a little bit. I haven't really played much of the others. I played a bit of LBJ before he toolbox theory, so probably would rank him a bit lower just on the fun factor. Really, he has Ascendant Mechanic put back in, so I might go ahead and bump him up, or I might keep him in the same place. Well, you'll have to watch and find out. So part of it's just my own opinion on how things can go, how good a country they'd leave behind. Part of it's just based off how fun they can be. But I can only base that on the president runs I have played. So it's kind of hard to fully rank that. So we'll just start from the beginning. So Richard Nixon, you can do as good or as bad as you really set out. It's kind of hard-coded that he will resign no matter what you do. So it kind of just leaves a bedrock. So since you can't really change the shift of the nation one way or the other very much, it's only fair to go ahead and put him in C tier, because he can't really do too much good or too much bad. And on that similar note, Mr. I never asked for this himself, Mr. McCormick, John McCormick, elected the president after JFK is fucking shot. Poor guy, you feel bad for him. What you do with McCormick basically dictates how the elections are going to go in 64. If you decide to pardon Nixon or do this and that, it'll make you NPP look better in some states and look worse in others. It's not the most consequential other than political power and legacy. And so, with that in mind, it's kind of hard to rate McCormick. That said, he can be a bit more of a unifying figure. And depending on who ends up being elected, you could argue that he's just the caretaker. And if he can do a decent job caretaking with South African War, that just depends on how the player wants to handle it. And stuff like that. So I'll probably bump him up a tier. Just sort of with that in mind. Because it is possible to do some decent with him. While Nixon is just kind of hard-coded to be anywhere from not good to just sort of, he was cool, but then he did horrible things and he had to leave. So, with that in mind, we'll go ahead and talk about the NPP and the RD candidates for 1964. Because that seems like a fairly natural place to go for. Starting off, let's go and talk about, who should we talk about? There are two George Wallaces, so it just seems like he's demanding to be elected, or talked about. So, I'll go ahead and talk about the NPP candidates, as well as the offshoots that they can go ahead and have. So, starting off with George Wallace, the gamer, well, he's not the gamer candidate. That's probably Yaki. The NPP far-right candidate, the Dixiecrat, Mr. Segregation Now, Segregation Tomorrow, and Segregation Forever. He probably has to go in D tier. The reason why I don't put him in F is because you don't have to do the awkward segregation stuff, so that makes things better. He also does pretty decent on the economy. There's some fun little economic stuff that you can do with him. You can do a halfway decent economy. Foreign policy can be kind of fun. Same with the other NPP candidates, but you can do some decent stuff with that. There's also an event if you don't do any of the segregation stuff, which the game does consider a real possibility. So, with that in mind, you don't have to go down that path. But, assuming, well, there are a couple of different paths you can go down with social path, related segregation. You can either do nothing, which on paper that sounds like not a bad option. You just keep the Civil Rights Act, and you don't mess with it or anything like that. Not bad, right? But that same event, which has like the sunset ending, everyone's sort of getting along. George Wallace thinks, you know what? Maybe this not discriminating and being racist thing isn't half bad. There's a little notification saying the Yaki popularity is rising. So the problem with Wallace not doing this path is that while in theory, it's better to not be racist. That's an obvious fact. It is better to be racist than not racist. That might be a hot take. I don't know. But I don't believe in racism. And so George Wallace not being racist, thumbs up I'm happy with that. But the far right, at least in 64, is the voice of the more skeptical part of that. And so if you have the main guy and the main figure not doing one of the main bases, there are a couple things that could happen. They can just stay in that sect of a party, or they can look for other options. And if the Democratic option, because Wallace Roosevelt still believes in democracy, so shout out to him for that, they might turn to someone like Mr. Gamer over here, who doesn't believe in democracy. And so that's not a good option. Of course, he can actually go ahead and try to do segregation, which can either result in enforcing the Jim Crow laws in the South, or, which is very hard to do, but would be very bad if you can't pull off, you can do nationwide segregation, which obviously does not end well, and it can result in you being impeached, which will go ahead and lead us to the next president, Curtis LeMay. Depending on how you handle the Wallace stuff, he can get impeached, and if that happens, you have sort of a transition president with LeMay. Now, with LeMay, you have a couple different options. It's mainly with the social stuff. You can kind of keep the status quo and just not do anything with civil rights after it's been revoked. Or you can just go ahead and say, you know what, screw it. We're going to pass the Civil Rights Act. We're just going to be done. So, hypothetically, in 64, if this happens, if he's impeached before the 68 election, you can either pass civil rights and have something decent happen, or you can not, and maybe one of the other presidents can do that. Or you can just go ahead and pass it and get it over with for the Band-Aid off. So with that in mind, I'll probably put him in the same ranking as Nixon. Not a bad guy. Can be bad if you want to play him. He also has some of the funniest events, I gotta say. He will curse out the various figures. If you have the event where Martin Bormann visits Germany, there's an event where he will just cuss out Bormann and just say the most raunchy shit while the press corps is watching and taking notes. It's incredible. It's pretty funny. There are just events where he will yell at people to pass this bill. I think is very, very funny, very LBJ-esque, which we'll get to LBJ when we get to him. So, in that sense, I do like that about him, and so that probably brings him up to C tier for me as well, because it's kind of fun to read those events. So, let's go ahead and transition to old Robbie Kennedy, RFK. The Kennedys, those poor, poor people. RIP, IRL, and can also get murdered in-game as well. So let's talk about Rob Kennedy. I'm going to go ahead and put him in the A tier. There are a couple reasons why I put him in A tier. At the baseline, if you can do some pretty solid stuff with him. Economic stuff to get people out of poverty. Nothing bad ever happens to Kennedys. Pretty much. You got the right idea, Mike. Decent economic stuff, get rid of poverty. You have a pretty solid branch of the social stuff to end segregation and institute some laws to make things better. I always like, because I played Robert Kennedy, if you do the compromise path, you can do some neat stuff like protect the environment and then do a couple stuff while working on that compromise to go ahead and get the Civil Rights Act passed. There's a fun little story there, which I really enjoyed. You also have touring across the country, your fight against poverty, and there is an interesting little mechanic, which thankfully has been expanded on since the last time I did this list, where you have to balance being this firebrand progressive with the more not so progressive elements of the NPP. So there's a neat little mechanic and a balancing act. I think part of my problem with Kennedy is that the mechanics aren't necessarily explained the best. You have the idea of what'll happen, of course. You have the mechanics, so you have an idea. You kind of have to balance it a little bit somehow. But it doesn't explain to you that if you go too progressive or you're not careful enough, Kennedy will be shot and fucking murdered in a motel along with his vice president. And leads us to, well, we'll get to the next guy when we get to him. And so it doesn't really explain that very well, at least from what I remember. I know they added some mechanics to make it a bit better, but it's a bit of a weird mechanic, and they don't really explain it very well as well. Also, I don't necessarily know, there's the obvious historical parallels of Kennedy being shot in real life to him getting killed in game. But especially with stuff like COINTELPRO, you could have just another he resigns or he's impeached. I think that would be a lot more interesting, personally, to have that dynamic going on. So with that in mind, I put Kennedy in A tier because if you can manage it pretty well, you'll have a decent go at it, I think. And I'm partial to Kennedy because I did the series on him. I had a lot of fun with it. But it might not go so well if you don't balance it well. I mean, I know nothing bad ever happened to Kennedys, but you want to be careful with that. And since we're talking about what'll happen if you don't manage RFK, it's only natural we talk about old Strom Thurmond. Strommy boy. Essentially George Wallace on steroids. I think I read a YouTube comment on that in the last category. That's essentially the case. Strom Thurmond is, imagine George Wallace, except he has to be racist, and there's nothing good about him. And that's Strom Thurmond. For that, I kind of have to put him in F tier, because either he'll try to pack the courts and revoke the Civil Rights Act. If he manages to succeed in that, he's going to boost popularity of the communists. Not good. I think if he doesn't do that, it's nice, but I think Yagi support skyrockets as well. So it's a lose-lose either way. On top of that, there's no economic tree. You can get to the foreign policy tree, hypothetically, if you want. But it's just not good. There are also the Bormann events. Wallace and Thurmond actually have pretty similar events where the Nazis will go ahead and congratulate either Thurmond or Wallace on their policies towards the minorities of America. And they both feel pretty nasty about that because, yeah, no shit, the Nazis are giving props to you on your racial opinions. That's not a good thing, typically, in my opinion. So with that in mind, along with all the nasty stuff that kind of has to happen, spitting up the legacy of the Kennedys, and the event where Kennedy is assassinated and Thurmond is elected is called the Death of Hope. So with that in mind, it is a bit odd. It's kind of clear in my mind. It's not. There's not much debate. It's F tier for me. Now let's go and switch over to the RDs. We have Wallace Bennett and LBJ. I'll go and talk about Bennett because he's gotten the most facelift, and it hasn't changed my opinion about him too much because I always liked Bennett. I never thought he was quite an S tier candidate, but I do think that he is a solid A tier. He does some pretty damn solid economic stuff, which is always decent to have. I believe he might be the best president for the economy outright, and with new economic mechanics that have been added in Toolbox Theory, that can mean a lot, and it is pretty fun to just see the green line go up. He also has a pretty interesting social policy where, you have the whole mechanic of you can't rock the boat. You have to keep the Democrats and the Republicans united. So you have to balance the liberals in the Republican Party or the Dixiecrats over the Democratic Party. You also have to manage your relations with the Mormon Church because Bennett's a Mormon, and you have to balance that out. And so it's fun to see how that happens. So you can go ahead and get a baseline Civil Rights Act, and you can expand on that, or you can keep it the same, or you can arguably weaken it. I don't know exactly what happens with Dixiecrat, because I don't think anyone does Dixiecrat Wallace. I believe the meta is Liberal Wallace. But you have a couple different options, and you have different ways on how you want to approach it. And the worst that can really happen is that the RDs end up falling apart and collapsing, which isn't the best, but unless there's some crazy meta on Bennett to blank to Yagi or Hall, which I'm sure there might be, it's not going to result in anything dramatically horrible. Outside of how the player manages via foreign conflicts, of course. So with that in mind, Baldman Bennett, A tier. Next, LBJ. Now, I admittedly didn't play LBJ that much. I played him a little bit after I made the original tier list. And I believe he now has the Senate mechanics, which, if I knew that he didn't have a Senate mechanics at the time, I would have put him probably like A tier, because what he can do is pretty decent overall for America. But the fun factor just kind of isn't there. That said, he does have a Senate mechanics. The only question is, do I still want to put him in S tier? And I did some thinking about it, and while he is probably pretty high in that A tier, I don't know if he quite makes it to S tier. So I'm going to put him in A tier as well. You can do a lot of solid stuff with LBJ. Great Society, food stamps, because TNO lore, great deal. The New Deal doesn't happen, so you don't have any of these baseline programs that were there to begin with, or they're much less than were enacted in our timeline. So you don't have, Social Security or anything like that. So it's a pretty fun dynamic to start from nothing and then go all the way up from there. And that's pretty interesting. I think the thing that always throws me off about LBJ is that if you do keep doing everything that he says and keeps reforming, everyone just kind of gets annoyed at you. And as a result, you'll have mass defections over to the NPP far right, which that makes sense. But you also have people defecting to the center, which that never really made sense to me either. But he can kind of mess up his party, which might be, you'll leave the country in a decent place, but if you want to do, like, LBJ to one of the other RDs, it's a little confusing, and I never really fully got that mechanic. And so that's kind of kept me from going to A tier. I think they said they might have been changing that. If they did change that, I'd take it back, and you can move him over to S tier. But from my understanding, doesn't really make much sense, in my opinion. And so that's why I went ahead and put him in A tier. You can obviously agree or disagree with that. That's up to you. So let's go ahead and move on to the 1968 candidates. Probably some of the more interesting ones, in my opinion. So we start with the NPP. We'll go ahead and stick with them. Let's go ahead and start with Mike Herrington, who, in my opinion, is kind of the most boring and kind of the most pointless president, in my opinion. He's the most confusing as to why he's here. I'll put him into B tier. It never made sense. The more I think about it, it doesn't really make sense for Herrington to be a presidential candidate. Really, at all. He wasn't really that active. There are more obvious examples. There's a whole Reddit post I read about how Hubert Humphrey would probably be a better option, though you'd have to rework the RFK branch, of course. But it doesn't make sense for this borderline, I think even self-admitted socialist to go ahead and institute a modern democratic socialist platform in 1960s America. Say what you will about the policies today and whether they should or should not be implemented today. I'm more than willing to have a discussion, but we're talking about the 1960s here. Not only that, 1960s, which doesn't even have the baseline Great New Deal programs that are decent baseline. So you're really going to struggle starting from there. His Civil Rights Act, again, I'm not a fan of racism, I made this very clear. But if he gets the max out of his Civil Rights Act, I believe it alienates a lot of the base there, and a lot of people think that I don't know if that might be a bit too much. And then you'll have Yawkey support rise, and you don't want any fascism in America, so that's never really good. He also just, I'll be honest, he just kind of bores me. He, like I said, it doesn't make sense for him to be a president, if I'm fully honest. And so he just kind of sticks out as a sore thumb to me. If you manage how to do it well, you can have a decent option. You'll get rid of poverty. I don't think the economy will be the best, admittedly. Although I'm going to be very careful on critiquing people for not having the best economy, because we're going to get to someone who I'm very much a fan of, and arguably is not the best for the economy either, but we'll get to that when we get to that. Moving on from old Herrington, Margaret Chase Smith, one of the most more interesting ones. She's sort of the, I'll put her in CG, I'll explain why. She's sort of the Iron Woman, basically the equivalent like a Thatcher in the UK, and probably in our timeline. And you have a couple different options. Her main deal is trying to unite the NPP into a single unified party. But you have a couple different approaches for that. You can stick with the NPP center and go and pass some pretty left-wing ideas. I believe you can arguably be more progressive in like Herrington or stuff like that. Well, that's another thing for Herrington. RFK and LBJ can do way more, it feels like. And it doesn't really make sense for this guy who's supposed to be like the democratic socialism. Like, this goes off from like a communist NPPL type. It doesn't make sense for him to have like the moderate LBJ or RFK. So that's just another point where it doesn't make sense. Sorry, that's enough Herrington bashing for now. Chase can stick with the center, or she can pivot to the far-right Dixiecrat, emerging neoconservative branch of the party, or she can try to walk that middle branch, which is pretty interesting. And, you know, there are various pros and cons to all of them, which I can't think of off the top of my head. The thing that really throws me off about Chase Smith is that I forget exactly what happens. I forget if you have to do the right pivot or if popularity has to fall apart. Depending on how bad things go in a Chase Smith presidency, you can go ahead and end up siding with Yawkey and get his support. And that goes ahead and starts some pretty uncomfortable chain of events. You have hate crimes spiking up against Asians. Not fun. If it happens in the 1972 election, Yawkey will just go ahead and replace Chase Smith automatically as the candidate for the NPP, which gives a pretty decent gateway to electing President Yawkey. And the gamers. Jesus Christ, indeed. Yeah. So, you're probably not going to have this in most Chase Smith playthroughs, admittedly. But, I'm not a fan of that, I'll be honest. Now, from a gameplay point, I guess, I'm not a fan of that being a real possibility. From a gameplay point, I do think it's kind of cool, I guess, that you do have that option, but I just can't abide by that, personally. So, Margaret Chase Smith, probably C tier. You can do decent with her, but you can go very, very bad with her. So yeah, with that in mind, we have Barry Goldwater and John Glenn. I'll stick with Goldwater for now, and then I will get my little video essay on why John Glenn is the best president in TNO. Oh, spoiler alert. Spoiler alert. Let's talk about Barry Goldwater. Interesting figure in real life. I don't really know what I think about Barry Goldwater, IRL. And some of that weird ambiguity is sort of captured in his TNO presidency. I'll put him in C tier, and I'll explain why. There's some interesting pros. He's very strong on environmental regulations. You can get some pretty solid stuff there. His economic tree can be pretty solid, especially, I think the Bennett one, if you go for the Bennett path, it's pretty solid. I think Reaganomics is also a decent path. Say what you will about the actual real-life implications of that. It itself is not too bad. He's also the only president that will outright refuse to meet with Martin Bormann in that little event chain, which you can arguably say may not be the best from like a realpolitik standard, but there's a nice little event because he would be the first Jewish president, and I'm reflecting on what exactly it would mean to, if his family stayed over there, they would not be alive today. And there's like probably one of my favorite little event end notes is just like America is no friend to monsters or something like that. I always thought that was a neat little event, neat little tagline. That's something I like about Goldwater. Something a bit more dubious, depending on whether there is a Civil Rights Act or not. There will be a reaction tree, because I think a lot of the 68 presidents can have reaction trees to the past administration. Goldwater has the option to pass the Civil Rights Act or not pass the Civil Rights Act, or depending on whether it's not there or not, remove or weaken that Civil Rights Act. Now, it sort of goes into this weird, complex Barry Goldwater view on segregation, where he helped desegregate his home state of Arizona, but he also voted against the Civil Rights Act in 63, 64, 65, I want to say. Around that time. I forget exactly which one. And then he later said he regretted vetoing it. He's one of those states' rights guys who probably actually believes in state rights and doesn't say that just to not want to pass that, which is a whole other discussion. I don't want to get too much into that. So you have that kind of complex little thing going. I think one of the bad things about excuse me, some of the more iffy things about Goldwater, he can target unions, which at this time it's arguable that maybe they needed a bit of work. They can be kind of corrupt institutions, but he can go extra legal methods in order to target those unions and have them fall apart. And that's caught. That's not going to go well. He'll also go through extra legal methods to target either the communists or the Yankees. Now, I'm not a fan of commies or fascists, so I'm pro for that. But if it ends up getting exposed, or I think even if, I don't exactly know how it works, but Goldwater is what you'd call the he used to be at least the meta in order to get Yawkey and Hall, which we'll get to them in a second, but they're probably two of the worst president options. And so depending on how that goes, you can propel the Yankees or the commies into popularity, which is not very good at all, because, the extra legal methods never really end well. It's the reason Nixon gets elected out. If Kennedy's Bobby is caught with COINTELPRO, it'll tank his popularity and probably make him more susceptible to being shot. So that's not very good. Also, I don't know if this was still the case, but in before Toolbox Theory, I don't think he can get Hawaii or the Port Islands back, the treaty ports back. I don't know if that's changed since. If it hasn't, they should probably change that because it doesn't make sense. But that's just a little minor note. So, I don't really care about what order. I'll explain this real quick. Bobby's in like the top A tier. I kind of consider them all sort of the same. I don't put them in order based off who's better, who's worse. I just kind of put them in the area, and whoever's not there before, they're just put next to. So, Nixon isn't necessarily better than LeMay or any of them. I just organize like that. Anyway, so, I'm very biased because I did my YouTube series RFK to Glenn, and I had a lot of fun with that, and it's probably some of my it's the path I'm the most familiar with, the path I'm most acquainted with, and as a huge space/NASA nerd, I am a little bit biased. But with that in mind, I believe that John Glenn is the best president in TNO. So, let me go and explain why. You're pretty much going to have a Civil Rights Act no matter what with Glenn, unless you really fuck up or your Senate is just completely screwed up. If you go from what is it? It's Wallace to Glenn, you'll have an option to pass the Civil Rights Act, and you don't have the option to not. It only matters whether or not you can end up getting it passed, I believe. You have a reaction path to Thurmond, which is also pretty nice as well. On top of that, there's the obvious space stuff, which I'm very much into. I love space. You can land on the moon, which the U.S. doesn't manage to before NASA's defunded at the start of the game. You can also land on fucking Mars, which is undeniably fucking cool. Now, it does take up a fair bit of money, and the mechanics always kind of confuse me, because it feels like you just have to keep restarting or reloading the save in order to get it to properly work. But if you start getting it figured out, it can be kind of fun to figure out what to invest in. You have a whole science tree, which I'd probably would cut that down a little bit and put it into some more decisions, me personally. But I'm not a modder or a game dev, so I don't know the logistics how that would work. It's really fun to have that different. It's a very different focus tree and branch compared to the other presidents, which I do like a lot. It's very distinct. On top of that, you have some fun social stuff. You can go ahead and outlaw right-to-work laws. Very interesting. Very interesting. You can get a 6-hour work week put in. This is just because a lot of people say, oh, John Glenn only worries about space. That's not true. You can be a very progressive John Glenn if you want to be. And it's always kind of interesting. You can go ahead and put price caps on pharmaceutical prices. There's probably a lot more I'm forgetting. Social Security, you can go ahead and do that. The main mechanic he has is just kind of managing the space budget of NASA along with public opinion on NASA. And the worst thing that'll happen, really, is that you waste a bunch of money and people don't like you anymore. That's really the worst that can happen with Glenn, with, I guess, one exception, which I guess we'll talk about is foreign policy tree. John Glenn has quite possibly the biggest dick energy when it comes to his foreign policy. Technical term, of course. He'll start building nuclear reactors and start building up the nuclear stockpile. And he will keep building the nuclear stockpile. And he will start securing uranium mines all across the country. And he'll start sabotaging other uranium mines in Japan and Germany. Now, this can end very, very poorly. Because if you're discovered, I don't think it's properly programmed in at this point. But, in theory, if you are discovered, that can lead to World War III. And thermonuclear annihilation, which, never good. I will give you guys that. That said, you have to really, really fuck up. And it might just be because it's not fully properly programmed anyway, but if you're discovered, you have the option to either admit to it, which is stupid and it'll ruin your popularity, or you can just say, that wasn't me, what are you talking about? Just use the plausible deniability and they won't say anything because they can't prove anything. And then, you can get so many nukes that you will force Germany and Japan to come to the negotiating table and negotiate a treaty on thermonuclear weapons, which will lead to all three of the major superpowers dismantling their nuclear arsenals. So, it's a very high-risk, high-reward strategy. You can basically bully people into stopping the world from ending. If that's not fucking awesome, I don't know what is. That's fucking amazing. I know, McKed doesn't even play this game, and he knows that's fucking cool. Also, the landing on Mars super event is my favorite super event. The music, the space, the event that goes right before it might be my favorite event in the game, along with tied with some of the spear events as well. But it is a load of fun. It really is. And so, that's why I believe that John Glenn is the best president in TNO. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. Now that we're here, you might have noticed I have the 4 main guys in the 72 elections down here. McGovern, Scoop, Kirkpatrick, and McNamara. I always forget her name for some reason. But there's a few more 72 presidents who I didn't really get a chance to talk about. And there's a good reason. There's already enough events in the game that I already know they're not very cool. We'll talk about Hall first, because I think he is maybe the more interesting of the 3 F tiers. I guess I kind of spoiled where Yaki's going, but oh well. He's probably the more interesting of the 3 F tiers. First off, if America is down enough that they elect a communist to office, you're not in good shape anyway. So that's not a good start. He works on passing a Civil Rights Act, and if it passes, okay, fair enough. If it doesn't pass, it makes it sound like he's passing notes on who is going to be problematic and who might need to be removed. Which brings us to one of the other events that goes ahead and starts it off, which I think is an interesting angle to take Gus Hall. He will go ahead and get J. Edgar Hoover removed from the head of the CIA and replace him with one of his loyal guys, which, already off the bat, not the best idea, especially seeing how the subtext of what he's going to do. But how he does it is a little bit uncomfortable. He'll go ahead and out J. Edgar Hoover as a homosexual and use that as a justification to get him out. And that ends up starting what is called the Lavender Scare, which results in a lot of people getting kicked out for being gay. Which, I get this is the 1960s and 70s. We're already taught the civil rights era is already facing some hard opposition. I'm not expecting. It's not necessarily fair to expect our more modern views of gay marriage to affect our views of these guys, because that wasn't really an issue around then. Although this is the time period where the gay rights movement kind of starts picking up steam. But doing that shit and actively targeting someone based off sexuality is not very cool. And seeing how it ends up targeting and it probably screws over a lot of gay people, that's not very cool and wholesome in space gay communism, wholesome chungus of him. So, yeah. I don't need to know how he will end up developing to know that he's already F tier. So, yeah. And then we have Gamer Yaki. If you know anything about him, this shouldn't be surprising. I'll be completely honest. His in-game ideology is National Socialist. Already not off to a good start. He wants to be chummy with the Nazis. He wants to start war with Japan. Which already off the bat, not a good sign. Because Japan has nukes in this timeline. And so that's going to lead to World War III. Already not a good start off the bat. You have a lot of spooky scaremongering based off of race. It becomes pretty clear in some of the events that things are becoming less and less safe. You have poll watchers enacted to intimidate voters. You'll have an act that he tries to pass, which will either restrict press freedom, or if it doesn't pass, same idea with Paul. They make notes on who voted against it, and they say, well, it'll make things easier when we get a better grasp on things. Already not a good start to things. And yeah, if America is in... Same idea with Hall as well. If America is in a bad enough position where it elects someone like Yaki, things are not good. Say what you will about the American system, but it usually does decent enough that people aren't totally driven to elect radicals like this, who will normally toss out the democratic traditions. Let's not talk about contemporary politics or how that may or may not be the case nowadays, because that just gets to a whole nasty, gross discussion, and we're talking about a mod for a video game. So let's not get into those discussions. But, if you get to a position where Yaki or Hall are elected, America's not doing so well. And it's not a good sign for democracy. There's a reason why they have a super event, which doesn't, the color changes, they lose that last bastion of liberty, national focus. It's not good symbolically. So, with that in mind, it's pretty clear why, in my mind at least, those two are automatic F tiers. But let's go ahead and review. At top, John Glenn S tier, A tiers, we got RFK, Bennett, and LBJ. B tier, Herrington, and McCormick. C tier, Nixon, LeMay, Chase Smith, Goldwater. D tier, George Wallace. F tier, I always forget his name, Thurmond, there we go. And then Hall and Yaki. May you rest in peace. Johnny Kennedy, have to pay respects. And then, I don't know, they might be fine. They might not be. Wait till there's content. McGovern, Scoop, Kirkpatrick, and McNamara. So that's my opinion. This is not objective by any means. There's probably a fair bit of room for discussion on a lot of these, and I'm willing to hear it. Probably like S to D tier. I'm sort of maybe not D tier. S to a lot of these C tiers, I'm flexible, and I'm pretty open to hear the conversations and debates on what you guys think personally. Anyway, so go ahead and leave a comment. Try to keep it civil. If not, it's a YouTube comment section, so I'm not, it's no beat off of my sweat off of my brow. Is that how the saying goes? I don't know. I'm not gonna sweat it too much. If you like this video, leave a like. If not, feel free to dislike. I know you can't see the dislikes, but it's at least good for me to know if I need to work on anything or not. It's good for my frame of reference at the very least. Even if you can't see it, I can. Comments down below. If you have any other ideas or stuff like that, leave them down there. I read all of the comments I get. Appreciate all of them that I get. If you want to send a few bucks more, right? I have a Patreon. If you want to chat about games, I have a Discord. If you want to see me do sort of live like this right now, I have a Twitch, which you can go and check out. All of which are down in the description box. All those links are down in the description box below. And, yeah, that's really about it for now, folks. Thanks for watching as always. My name has been Dogwood333, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.